So I've watched the final 2 episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion as well as the End of Evangelion, and I have thoughts and feelings and ideas, and I want to share them with you. And what you're about to see is an excerpt from my weekly show Story Secrets that I record every week for my patrons. If you would like to get access to the full show, take a look at patreon.com/Father Roderick. I would love it if you could join my Patreon community. In this episode, I want to talk about my first impressions, and it's just first impressions. I'm not at the point yet where I would dare to give an analysis and an explanation of the finale of this story, but I want to tell you what my first thoughts are after having seen the 2 last episodes of the television series, and then also the 2 other episodes that were made a year later after the television series finale got a lot of backlash from the fans at the time. So they retold the story of what happens at the end of the Shinji's journey, you could say, but this time from another perspective and from a different angle, and also with changes. And it's fascinating to juxtapose these 2, to compare them to one another. And it also had a huge impact on me because I was expecting certain things to happen, and I was at first utterly confused, and I have had a lot of emotions while watching both the ending of the television series and also the End of Evangelion. That's the name, the overall title for these 2 kind of remade episodes. And that kind of wraps up that first part of the story, because of course the manga continues the story, and there are also a few other made-for-TV movies that have come out afterwards, which I haven't seen yet, but I'll get to that at a later point. So that's what I want to do first, give you my overall sentiment and my first thoughts about the way this story ends and where everything that I've been studying for so many months actually led to. And then what I want to do next time is to go back and rewatch. Now that I know how the story is ending, I want to go back to the first episode and do a deep dive analysis of everything that I now can see in that first episode, and then the second and the third. We'll be busy for a while. That I missed because I didn't know where the story went. I didn't know the full background. This is one of those genius stories that it really pays off to go back after you've seen how it ends. It's kind of a little bit with, I'm a big Star Wars fan. With Star Wars as well, what they do now is to enhance the movies that we already know by telling the backstory. So we've seen the story of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and now that we know how he spent his time on Tatooine between the prequels and A New Hope, that when you now rewatch A New Hope, that character all of a sudden has way more depth, and some of the things that he says carry much more weight than they had when that backstory wasn't there. And so I love that when the story has so many layers, and so many layers are added to that story, that it makes you want to go back and reevaluate what you thought you knew. That, for me, is part of the attraction of Neon Evangelion, or Neon Genesis Evangelion. So that's what we're going to do. And then every week when I do a deep dive per episode, I will also create a short TikTok video where I just take one highlight of that episode, or I will just probably repackage it or re-record it. But as you know, the TikToks are only a few minutes. It's 2-3 minutes. What I do on TikTok is usually considered to be very long because it's a short attention span type of medium. But I hope that people are intrigued by what they see on TikTok, so that they come over, and if they become a patron, they can also join you as an audience and listen to these shows. What I love about this story is that it is not just a story about, huge mega robots fighting each other. What the creators wanted to do was to set it apart from series that do that, are about these big mech robots fighting and battling each other. They wanted to give this story more of a soul, maybe even literally in a certain way. And that is why, from the beginning, we follow the pilots of those big, robots or whatever creatures they are. And we get to know a little bit of their backstory. And the series constantly switches between the very mundane day-to-day life of these kids, because they're all like 13, 14 years old, trying to deal with school, with, their burgeoning emotions and going through puberty and whatnot. So on the one hand, this looks like a very kind of common Japanese slice of life type of anime. And then there are these big dramatic fighting scenes, this overall huge mythology that shows you little pieces of what's going on, but never reveals the full truth. And even at points during the story tries to kind of make you think about things in a certain way, and only to completely turn that upside down later on when you realize what is truly going on. And this is not just true for us as an audience, but it's also true for a lot of the main characters who have actually no idea what they are involved in. And then there is a third layer. So you've got the slice of life stuff, you've got the big mythological apocalyptic battle going on, and then there is the inner journey. There is what connects these two stories is what happens on the inside of the main characters, and more particularly of Shinji, who is the main character. I wouldn't say the hero of the story, because he definitely is not a hero and doesn't see himself as a hero, but he's the protagonist. And because of this inner story, which also is about a battle, but it's not a battle with forces from the outside, it's an inside battle between the good and evil inside of every one of us, with trauma and hurt and fear and everything that holds us back, and then at the same time this longing for liberation, for healing, for something else. And because you have that external story of a battle, and you've got that internal story, and it is at the same time about these regular kids that a lot of us can identify with, because we've all been, at that age, 13, 14 years old. So we do recognize a lot of their emotions and the conflicts and the little things that make life very hard at that age. But what I believe is so genius about this story is that ultimately the bigger story, the big outside external battle, is, I think, a metaphor of the inner battle. And that brings me to the last two episodes of the television series and why they are so incredibly good. And I know that this is kind of a solitary position. Not many people actually liked the ending of the television series. Even the majority of the people that follow me on TikTok, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, most of them agree that the way the television show ends is rubbish. And if you really want to get a good experience of the ending of the story, you have to watch the End of Evangelion. I disagree. And I really want to stress how much these last two episodes, first of all, follow from the entire story that came before it. And then secondly, are told in a way that is so creative and innovative, and touch upon such deep layers that are so relatable, that I actually believe that the way the television show ended is far superior to the way they wrap up the story in the End of Evangelion. It's for me, it's no doubt, no discussion possible. The television show ending is the ending that this story needed. And yes, the movie gives a lot of context and gives you a lot of so what was going on, what we didn't see in the television show, but it's only information. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't go to the core of what this story is about, which is this inner conflict. And so the last two episodes of the series are almost entirely taking place inside the minds of the main protagonists, especially Shinji, but also to a lesser extent Asuka and Rei. And it's very atypical. Now, one of the kind of pragmatic reasons for these final 2 episodes to be so different, also stylistically, is that they actually ran out of time and they ran out of resources. The whole series was made under extreme duress. It was very, very difficult to get these episodes done in time, especially getting the story started. Took months and months of preparation. I think the first episode, it took them 6 months to write it and to prepare for it. And so they were in a crunch time-wise. They also were in a crunch budget-wise. There was almost no money left. And this is still an anime from the time that everything was hand-drawn. And so, yes, of course, there are a few, I think, computer graphics involved, but still, every second that you see consists of 24 individual frames. That's how animation works. Or in this case, in anime, oftentimes much less frames. And that's one of the ways that anime has such a distinct style. It's oftentimes because they use one cell, sometimes for several seconds, and they will just change or move the background. But the rest of the image is static. That's why everything is so stylized, and oftentimes you're looking at a scene, for instance, when they go down to the city below the surface of Tokyo 3, and the only thing that moves is the background. It's the elevator, but the rest is static. It was just a very pragmatic way of saving money, because then you don't have to draw all these different, cells. You can just use one drawing and then just have the background move. You just make a bigger background. So what was conceived as a way to cut the budget, it was something that made also in a certain way the look that we associate so much with anime. And the problem was that for the last 2 episodes of the television series, they were under contract. They didn't even have the money, the budget to do like super low level cell animation. So even with the tricks that they used in previous episodes, they weren't able to get to the end of the story. And so that's why they had to resort to even more mundane sources of imagery. And that's why in these 2 last episodes, you will also see real footage, like just stock footage from people, from trains, from whatever. And you see sketches, you see pencil sketches. They reuse almost everything that they created in the past, including their pencil sketches, to tell that story of what happens on the inside of Shinji's mind. So it's super abstract, and I can totally see why that is jarring to a lot of people. But what I think is so genius is that despite those constraints, despite that crunch, it still does something extraordinary, because the journey of Shinji, what he goes through, what he starts to realize over time, is so deep and so true. And the reason I think that it has such an emotional impact, at least on me, is that this is actually based on Hideaki Anno's own experiences. He has often said in interviews that he suffers from depression, and that before he started to make Neon Genesis Evangelion, he had a period of time, several years, where he was in a deep depression. And then someone gave him a book about psychology. I'm not exactly sure which book it was, but during his depression, he started to read that book, and to him it was a revelation. That psychology book helped him to understand what was going on, why he was suffering from depression, what the choices were that he needed to make. And a lot of what you see in Shinji's character, and that also is sometimes grating and irritating, is like he's always crying, always whining, complaining, always blaming everyone around him, but he's afraid to look inside. So he is constantly on the run. He wants to hide between other people, and then when other people don't help him, he feels even more powerless. Very, very similar, I think, to what many people who suffer from depression also experience. You're closed up from the world. It seems like you're completely isolated. No one can help you, and you can't help yourself. So there doesn't seem to be an exit. And having more insight in how your brain works, how your emotions are linked to neural pathways, and how trauma can make certain connections in your brain that are not healthy, but you keep repeating the patterns, and so that always kind of repeats and even strengthens the depressed feelings. Once you start to understand how that works, you can also maybe discover a way out. And that is what is happening in these last 2 episodes, where Shinji, who has gone through so much emotional trauma in his early years, he lost his mom, he has a horrible father. Again, not spoiler, because it's in the first episode. His father is a horrible person. He every time that he fights these angels, these aggressive monsters, it's a reflection of what's happening inside of him. He feels like he's in a fight with forces that he can't understand, that seem to come back all the time, and there's no end to it. And if you've defeated one, then there is another one that pops up. Just like in depression, you may sometimes have that feeling that no matter what you do, no matter how much you try to resist, it comes back in waves, and then it takes you back into that darkness and into that solitude. And there seems to be no victory possible until you start to realize that you are the one that can make a change, that healing has to come from the inside. Yes, with maybe outside help and with people that explain to you, or a book, that it can tell you this is how it works. You have to do the work. There's no one who can do it for you. You can't take a pill against depression. You can take medication to suppress the symptoms. But the origin of what causes this inner darkness, that's a fight you have to fight yourself. That, I think, and I'm not a psychologist, but this is what I gather from the story. This is what Hideaki Anno wanted to tell. It's about his own battle and his own efforts to overcome this isolation by opening up to the people and by accepting that life is fundamentally broken. That it's not, it's no use to run away from pain and suffering like we all do, but people that suffer from depression do it maybe to the extreme. But that the only way to get out of that darkness is to accept that even though you may step into the light, it's not going to be like heaven. There's still going to be pain and violence and suffering, but you have to grow stronger. You have to make the deliberate decision that you want to live and that you are worth living, and that despite suffering, you still have value. And so that's a journey that I think is explained very well in these last 2 episodes. And for me, that was the core of the story. So I was so fascinated that they dared to tell that part of the story and forego the whole, bigger mythology. Which brings me to the end of Evangelion, which is the movie, where in these 2 more cinematic versions of this ending, they show what happened at the same time in the outside world. And so, yeah, that's fascinating. That's really riveting. And it's also very shocking, because that battle also culminates in a lot of violence. And there were times there I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they put this in the movie. There is this infamous scene in the hospital that a lot of people on TikTok wanted me to comment upon. And that's just part of the tragic decisions that Shinji takes over and over again. And it's just minor tragedy compared to the mass murder that takes place in that final episode. It's really gruesome. I want to warn you that this is unlike anything you've seen in the television series. And yet, it's kind of the logical conclusion of that story. It is an apocalyptic battle. But what is the big shocker of the end of Evangelion is not the scope of that final battle, but it is that in that movie, Shinji takes different decisions. Instead of healing, he is actually getting worse. And so it's almost like a mirror image of the end of the television series. It's like you know that in Stranger Things, you've got the regular world, and then you've got the, how do they call it? The underworld, or the upside down. And this is what gave me such a whiplash when watching the end of Evangelion. I was like, but where is the story that they were telling in the last 2 television episodes? This is the opposite. And it's only after seeing the whole thing that I started to wonder, well, maybe that's on purpose as well. Maybe that is what they wanted to do, to tell 2 possible endings, which then makes the end of Evangelion very intriguing and definitely worth re-exploring. But, and I'm going to wrap things up and then I'm going into spoiler territory, but my final thoughts about the end of Evangelion is that it baffled me. I was watching, and again, I've studied this series. I thought I knew what was going on. And then I'm just, there were so many moments during that movie that I was like, what is happening? What am I watching? There are like minute-long sequences where I'm completely out of any clue as to why that is included. There are hints that there is a rhyme and reason to all that, but at the same time, it goes so fast and there's so much happening that I just don't have the time to think about it. And so at the end of that movie, I was exhausted. I was emotionally, intellectually, completely exhausted. I was like, oh my goodness, I have to rewatch this multiple times, and I probably will have to do a lot of research in order to fully understand why they told the story this way and why this story, this version of the story, is so different and in many ways opposite to what they showed at the end of the television series. So I had so many emotions. There was also a lot of tragedy in the end of Evangelion. There are moments where you're like, oh, no, they didn't do, really? There were just times where I was just, man, don't tell this. I don't want to see this story. It's too emotional. It's too hard. It's too painful. And you know what? That's probably, again, on purpose. They want us to feel like that. This is why this series is so good. It makes us feel so much. It makes us emote and reflect and relate to what we see. And there are not many series or many movies that are able to do that because we're so engulfed with media, with stories, and a lot of it is forgettable. There's so many stories where, like, yeah, that's a good popcorn movie. I had a good time. And then you ask me a week later, what was the movie about? Yeah, something with dinosaurs. I don't know about the rest. With Neon Genesis Evangelion, I mean, I can tell you for hours which moments struck me and what made me think and what I discovered. And there's not a single day that I'm not thinking about the meaning of Neon Genesis Evangelion. And it's not just because I make stuff for TikTok. It's just because this story is so good and I want to rewatch it. And, well, that's why I'm doing this show. That's why I'm sharing that with you, knowing very well that not everyone will be as passionate about this series. But I know that there are enough of you that appreciate this. And maybe even years later, some of you may listen to this years after I've recorded this and still hopefully get some value out of it.